In the debate over the destruction of the World Trade Center, two important organizations have played a major role. One is NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was officially tasked by the U.S. government to investigate the collapse of the three skyscrapers. For the Twin Towers, NIST concluded that they were brought down by the consequences of the impacts and the ensuing fires, while Building 7, according to NIST, was brought down primarily by fire alone. The other organization to bear weight on the debate has been Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, an association of professionals in civil construction. Architects and Engineers lists over 2,000 experts in structural engineering, science of materials, architectural design, fire protection, science of construction, metallurgy, and even experts in controlled demolitions. The debate on the collapse of the Twin Towers centers around two major questions. One is what caused the initial collapse of the top section of the building onto the lower part of each tower. The second is what caused the complete destruction of the remaining healthy structure below, once the top section had collapsed on it. As far as what initiated the collapse, at first we were told that the heat of the fires had softened and melted the structure of the building.
In 2002, NOVA depicted a scenario envisioned by many experts at the time, that the truss connections failed in the extreme heat, causing the floors to fall onto one another, precipitating the collapse.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give. Then you had this sequential failure that took place where it all pancaked one after the other.
In fact, it became known as the pancake theory. But the pancake theory had a major flaw. It forgot to explain why the core structure of the towers collapsed. Furthermore, experts pointed out that jet fuel produces barely half the heat needed to melt steel. It would not have been enough to disconnect the trusses from the external structure. At that point, the official explanation backtracked and settled for a more generic weakening of the steel due to the fires.
You don't need to melt the steel columns, you just need to start weakening them.
What we found is it doesn't take temperatures high enough to melt steel. It just has to heat up the steel so it expands and then softens and weakens the structure until it collapses.
The trusses stayed connected to the columns even as they sagged from the heat. They pulled on the columns, bowing them inward nearly 5 feet in some areas, until the columns reached the breaking point.
Suddenly the columns snapped, and as a result the entire top of the building came down.
In conclusion, the known facts are: steel melts at about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Softening can begin at about 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Except for 3 isolated spots, NIST admits to have found no proof of temperatures beyond 480 degrees Fahrenheit, which is less than half the temperatures needed to seriously weaken steel. On the other hand, there is multiple evidence that the temperatures needed to seriously weaken steel were not reached for a sustained time in the Twin Towers. The first one is that a group of 16 people managed to descend through the area devastated by the impact without obviously being burned alive. One of them is Brian Clark.
And when we came to the 78th floor, the last layer was standing, but it was cracked, and there were flames licking up the other side of the wall like this. It wasn't a roaring inferno. I sensed that the flames were maybe starved for oxygen right there, you know, in the interior. We kept going, and we got onto the 74th floor. When we got down that far, normal conditions. The lights were on, fresh air coming up from below.
Had there been a temperature of 1,100 degrees around the stairwell, nobody would have been able to go through it alive. In fact, it could be suggested that NIST never explained the collapses by gravity alone because it would be impossible to do so without violating at least 2 of the most fundamental laws of physics. One is Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. This means that 2 opposing forces will neutralize each other. In a head-on collision, the 2 cars absorb each other's kinetic energy and transform it into physical deformation or damage. After that, the system comes to a rest, as there is no more energy to be dissipated.
The top section, pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
Let's go now to the Twin Towers and ask a simple question. Assuming that the top section on the left contains enough potential energy to destroy the rest of the tower, and assuming we dropped both upper sections at the same time, which one would hit the ground first? It would be the second, of course. As it finds no obstacles in its path, the section on the right would quickly accelerate to free fall speed and maintain it all the way to the ground. The section on the left instead needs to use some of its energy to destroy the structure below, so it could never achieve free fall speed. In the case of the Twin Towers, however, both upper sections fell with an acceleration close to free fall speed, as if their path had been practically free from obstacles. It took each tower between 10 and 12 seconds to collapse to the ground, while an absolute free fall time would have been 9.2 seconds. This brings us directly to the issue of explosions. On September 11, there were dozens and dozens of loud explosions reported. For all these explosions, however, the debunkers have a blanket explanation. The witnesses were confused. They were not real explosions.
There are things that happened inside the building, pieces coming loose as a result of the extreme impact. Very well may have been interpreted as explosion.
What's an explosion sound like? Most people don't know because most people have never heard one. So any sharp, loud bang, that's probably an explosion.
The fact is, most of the explosions were reported by firefighters and policemen, and no one knows how to recognize an explosion in a burning building better than they do.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion. Everybody just started running for the door.
The whole time you're hearing boom, 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 boom. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
In August 2005, the New York Times published 12,000 pages of oral histories rendered in the voices of 503 firefighters and emergency personnel who were present at the Trade Center on September 11. Over 100 of them, 1/5 of the total, has reported explosions in the buildings prior or during the collapses. According to several witnesses, there was a secondary explosion that took place in the basement of the North Tower just before the plane hit the building. But the witnesses described an explosion that took place in the basement before the impact of the plane.
Very strong. Boom! An explosion so hard that pushed us upwards. Upwards. And it came from the basement between the B2 level and the B3 level. Now, 20 years in the building, you know something that comes from the bottom and something that comes from the top. And when I went to verbalize that it was a generator, we hear boom, all the way on the top, the impact of the plane on the top. Two different events, two different times.
According to the 9/11 Commission, it was the jet fuel pouring down the elevator shafts that caused the explosion in the basement. From the final report we read, a jet fuel fireball erupted upon impact and shot down at least one bank of elevators. The fireball exploded onto numerous lower floors, including the B4 level, 4 stories below the ground. When faced with this precise question, the editors of Popular Mechanics chose not to answer it, and fell back on the generic explanation of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts.
Ask what your guys' explanation is for Willie Rodriguez's testimony that he heard, experienced, and his coworkers were actually burned by an explosion in the basement of the North Tower prior to the plane hitting, and this has been verified by at least 20 different eyewitnesses.
Jim Meggs of Popular Mechanics.
When the plane struck the buildings, they penetrated the internal core. Jet fuel poured down stairwells and elevator shafts, setting off secondary explosions. Not to mention the horrific impact of these fully loaded planes hitting the structure and causing an enormous swaying.
It's interesting to know too that
you still didn't address the fact that it was before
Empire State Building crash back in 1945.
But the explanation of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts has several problems of its own. First of all, there were no regular elevators connecting the basement to the top levels of the towers. Each tower consisted of 3 separate buildings, built on top of one another, each with their own elevator system. There were only 2 elevators connecting the lobby to the 44th and 78th floor. But the plane struck on the 95th floor, which means the fuel could not have poured down these elevator shafts. Most importantly, the theory of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts fails to take into consideration the volumes involved. Each tower had an approximate volume of 2,160,000 cubic yards. The planes that hit the towers carried an estimated 10,000 gallons of fuel each at the time of impact. 10,000 gallons is the equivalent of 50 cubic yards. This in-scale graphic shows what 50 cubic yards look like next to the volume of the tower. In any case, the fuel in the elevator shafts theory could never account for the powerful explosion that literally devastated the lobby of the North Tower 1 hour after the first impact and before the collapse of the South Tower.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
In fact, these firemen reported 3 large explosions in Tower 1, which took place after the plane's impact. They also confirmed it was the 3rd explosion to devastate the lobby of the tower.
We was in the explosion. We was in the lobby and the 3rd explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What you told me is that there was a plane or whatever hit the building, then a secondary explosion.
It was like 3 explosions after that. We came in after the fire. We came when the fire was going on already. We was in the staging area inside the building, waiting to go upstairs. And it exploded. The whole lobby collapsed on the lobby inside.
The situation in the lobby was such that there was no doubt on what had happened.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
We ran down the steps to the lobby. There was no lobby. Everything was torn up.
We came outside in the lobby. There was no lobby. The lobby was totally gone.
Did you see other people?
There was a woman there with her face blown off.
Firefighter John Schroeder was climbing the stairs of Tower 1 when he heard the huge explosion from below.
We were heading up to the 24th floor of the stairwell, and all of a sudden our building got rocked. We got bounced around in the stairwell like pinballs, man. And we just said, you know what? Time to go. We came down, it looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. Everything was exploded, everything was gone. We're like, what is going on here? For every window in the lobby to be exploded. I mean, them windows were like as thick as forget it. They were 2-3-inch glasses, you know, come on. They exploded out of the lobby, you know, it wasn't from the jet fuel. No way.
Then we have the accounts from those who heard explosions moments before the South Tower collapsed. John McLaughlin was a police officer for the Port Authority.
Going into Tower 1, we heard a loud explosion coming from the area of Building 2, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
We saw the top begin to blow out in a plume of smoke, and we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds, and turned around to see the building we just got out of. Antenna tip over and fall in on itself.
And then all of a sudden 3 tremendous explosions, and everything started coming down.
Then there was a tight sequence of detonations during the collapse of the South Tower, which many described as firecrackers.
You heard a big explosion before the building fell?
I saw it as it was happening, and it sounded as if you had 100 of those little black cat firecrackers and you lit them all off at once. That's what it sounded like. It sounded like the finale of the 4th of July.
As the first tower came down, there were a series of explosions. It was like boom, boom. You could hear the echoes of the explosions echoing off the different buildings.
The detonation started, and they went boom, boom, boom. They were a little less than a second apart.
Below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. Just
detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom. All the way down. So it was like boom, 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 boom.
From far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
The same kind of detonations were heard during the collapse of the North Tower.
Second tower, number 1, the second tower collapsed. It was the exact same series of detonations.
And then it started to sound like firecrackers. Crack, 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 crack. And we looked up, and the second tower was coming down.
Then there were several explosions recorded after both towers had collapsed, like this one from this BBC video.
This one was recorded after both of the twin towers had collapsed and before Tower 7's collapse.
Amateurs also kept recording explosions after the collapse of both towers.
It's now 11 o'clock. Still hear continuing explosions, but it's another explosion.
This recording was made between 10 and 11 o'clock. The explosion came from the direction of Building 7.
You gotta get back from here. You know that. You gotta get back.
In fact, a big explosion in Building 7 was reported before either tower had collapsed. Explosions near Building 7 were recorded up to a few minutes before the building collapsed. And finally, there is also someone who saw an explosion up close, through his very eyes. It's Ron DiFrancesco.
Exiting the building, he heard an explosion. He spun around, and a fireball was coming down the hallway at him. He put his arms up, blew him across Church Street. He woke up in the hospital 2 days later.
Yeah, I had burns, they say, on 80% of my body, and a broken bone in my back, and I guess my ears were turned inside out just with the burns. My head was very swollen. You know, I had my contacts in, so they were melted to my eyes, and...
To doubt the content of all these accounts does not mean to have debunked the claims of explosions. It means to willfully ignore dozens and dozens of dramatic testimonies which describe a story of September 11 quite different from the one we have been told so far. The last set of evidence against a gravitational collapse is the almost complete pulverization of all the contents of the Twin Towers, beginning with the concrete floors. Had a simple gravitational collapse occurred, one would expect to find 110 floors pretty much stacked up on each other, like it happens in regular collapses. In the case of the Twin Towers instead, practically all the concrete from the 110 floors of both buildings was literally pulverized.
What do you think this is?
I have no idea.
What your guess is?
Pulverized cement.
Pulverized cement? The concrete.
The concrete wasn't the only part of the buildings that was pulverized during the collapses.
We're talking here about 43,600 windows, 600,000 square feet of glass, 200,000 tons of structural steel, 5 million square feet of gypsum, 6 acres of marble, and 425,000 cubic yards of concrete, turned in good part into a cloud.
And then there were the contents of 110 floors of office space from each tower. It's hard to picture literally thousands of computers, desks, chairs, telephones, printers, and other office furnishings, floor over floor over floor, all enclosed in one building. This was one of the trading rooms of the World Trade Center. Had the floors simply collapsed on each other, all these things would have later emerged from the rubble, definitely crushed and torn, but still recognizable. Almost none of that was found.
There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal.
There wasn't a computer screen, a laptop. There was no office. I mean, it was, you know, 210-story buildings of office equipment.
You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big.
I haven't seen a door, I haven't seen a phone, I haven't seen a computer, I haven't seen a doorknob. I think that stands out.
Another thing that stands out is the complete absence of filing cabinets from the rubble. With 2 towers filled with offices from top to bottom, there should have been thousands of them, of every shape, size, and color. Only one was found, and it was definitely not in good condition.
Perhaps the most astonishing object Shate found is something there should have been thousands of. This one probably only survived because it was in the basement.
I'd pretty much given up trying to find some sort of intact file cabinet. But while I was at the compound for the Port Authority Police, this ball of metal about the size of a basketball was delivered to them. You can see what remains of the file folders.
The Twin Towers were also filled with people. Inexplicably, though, almost half of the victims' bodies seem to have disappeared into thin air. When a building collapses, the victims tend to remain trapped between the pancaking floors. They may be crushed and mangled, but in most cases they remain in one piece. According to the chief medical examiner, 2,749 victims died in the Twin Towers, but fewer than 300 whole bodies were recovered. Nearly 20,000 pieces of bodies were found in the ruins, more than 6,000 small enough to fit in 5-inch test tubes. 200 different pieces were matched to a single person. 1,630 victims were eventually identified, 800 of which by DNA alone. This means that for 800 victims, there were no body parts large enough to be recognizable. The remaining 1,119 victims were never identified. This means that for more than 40% of the victims, not even a fragment large enough to recover DNA was found. This map by the New York Fire Department shows the locations around the towers where human remains were found. Yellow circles are body parts from civilians. Red triangles are from firefighters. The very distance at which some of the body parts were found remains inexplicable with a simple gravitational collapse. In fact, fragments of human remains continued to emerge from ground zero for many years after the attacks. Then, in 2006, came the biggest surprise.
Demolition workers found 74 new bone fragments on the roof of the Deutsche Bank building over the weekend. That's the most found since the end of major recovery operations at the site.
The number of fragments found on the roof of the Deutsche Bank kept increasing by the day. Eventually, more than 700 bone fragments were recovered from the Deutsche Bank building. USA Today wrote, "The bone fragments are tiny, some the size of a pinky nail." Some debunkers have suggested that the bone fragments could have reached the roof of the Deutsche Bank after the impact of American 11, as some debris exited the opposite side of the tower in a southerly direction. But the view of the Deutsche Bank was blocked by the South Tower at the time of impact, and there was no direct line between the exit hole in the North Tower and the roof of the Deutsche Bank. Furthermore, as seen in this map, the body parts found on the roof belong not only to civilians, but also to firefighters, who were clearly not present in the North Tower at the time of impact.